It began with something small, almost invisible, the kind of change most people wouldn't notice until it was too late. A new sign, a fresh coat of paint on the road, a quiet decision made behind closed doors. But when I stepped outside one morning, the street I had called mine for years no longer was mine. The HOA had claimed it, stamped their authority onto the ground, and erased my rights in a single night. At first, it looked like control. Neatly written notices, clipped warnings, rules I never agreed to. But beneath the paper and paint was something darker, something that turned neighbors against each other and tightened around me like a trap. And then came the breaking point, the moment they crossed a line so sharp, so brazen, it demanded a response they could never forget. So I planned something they would never see coming. But tell me, what would you do if your own road was stolen from you? The outside, Maplewood Grove looked like the kind of neighborhood people worked their whole lives to reach. The homes stood shoulder to shoulder in neat rows, each with painted shutters and porches where rocking chairs seemed permanently parked. Trees arched over the road, their branches meeting in the middle to form a kind of tunnel that filtered the light in the late afternoon. It was safe, it was orderly, and for most people who lived there, it was exactly what they had hoped for. For me, it wasn't just another house in another development. This place was the reward at the end of a long climb. Years of scraping together savings, working hours that blurred into nights, and turning down things I wanted so I could put something away for the future, all of that had led here. When I signed the papers and held the keys for the first time, I felt a weight lift. This wasn't a rental, it wasn't temporary, and it wasn't borrowed. It was mine. I remember my first spring in the house. The air carried the smell of cut grass and the sound of kids laughing as they wove between sprinklers. I spent hours on my porch, watching the rhythm of the neighborhood fall into place. Mornings were filled with joggers pacing past, evenings brought parents calling children in for dinner, and at night the glow of porch lights formed a soft, unbroken chain down the street. It gave off a sense of calm that made it easy to believe this place could shelter me from anything. My neighbors were friendly in the kind of polite, surface-level way that makes life smooth but not too personal. They waved when they drove by, nodded when they walked their dogs, and exchanged short greetings while collecting mail. It wasn't cold, exactly, but it wasn't warm either. It was safe, consistent, predictable, the very things I had been craving. The HOA existed quietly in the background, at least at first. They sent newsletters every month, folded neatly and tucked into mailboxes. The pages were filled with announcements about neighborhood garage sales, encouragements to decorate for holidays, and reminders about rules. Most people probably skimmed them. I know I did. At a glance, it all seemed harmless, even cheerful, with fonts that looked like they belonged on birthday invitations rather than warnings. But beneath the friendly tone, I noticed certain words repeated again and again. Standards. Compliance. Uniformity. It was easy to brush past those words when life felt calm. I had no interest in causing trouble, and so I did what most people did, I fit into the rhythm. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays, edged the sidewalk every other week, and swept the porch when leaves started to pile up. My house blended with the others enough that no one had reason to complain. Still, there were moments, small ones, when I felt the weight of something unspoken. Once, while trimming my hedges, I saw a neighbor across the street watching me with the kind of expression that wasn't quite a smile. Another time, I found a letter in my mailbox from the HOA calling itself a gentle reminder to keep trash bins stored out of sight. The letter was short, polite, and even apologetic in tone. But reading it made me pause. My bins hadn't been out more than an hour past pickup. Who noticed? And who cared enough to report it? The neighborhood ran on little rules like that, and at first, I convinced myself they were harmless. Rules kept the place clean. Rules kept property values high. Rules gave everyone something to rely on. That's what I told myself as I folded the letter and tucked it away. But even then, before the real conflict began, I couldn't ignore the question that settled in my mind. What happens when rules stop being about keeping peace and start being about control? The thought lingered at the edges of my daily life. Every time I walked to the mailbox, I felt a flicker of unease, as if the envelopes might hold more than just newsletters or bills. Every time a car slowed while driving past my house, I wondered if eyes were measuring, judging, and waiting for something to be just a little out of place. Of course, outwardly, everything was still perfect. My garden bloomed in the spring, kids laughed as they played tag on the street, and on warm evenings I grilled dinner on the patio while fireflies blinked in the grass. From the outside looking in, nothing was wrong. But perfection often hides cracks, and Maplewood Grove was no exception. And in those quiet moments, when the sun slipped low and the street seemed just a little too still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the calm I loved so much was more fragile than it appeared. Life in Maplewood Grove carried a rhythm that was almost too smooth. Every day unfolded with a pattern that rarely shifted, like a song stuck on repeat. People woke, worked, watered their lawns, and waved at each other from a polite distance. And at first, I found comfort in that sameness. After years of scraping and hustling, this steady, quiet normal was what I thought I wanted most. The mornings were my favorite. I would sit on the porch with a mug of coffee, steam curling up into the cool air, and watch as the streets slowly woke. Joggers padded past, their shoes smacking the pavement in a steady rhythm. Neighbors opened garage doors and backed their cars out with the precision of clockwork. The newspaper boy tossed rolled-up copies onto driveways without even slowing down, his aim honed to perfection. Maplewood Grove wasn't exciting, but it was stable. And after a life spent moving from place to place, stability felt like a luxury. I got to know the small quirks of my neighbors just by watching them. Mrs. Avery across the street knelt in her rose beds every evening like it was a sacred ritual, trimming each blossom with surgical care. The Millers were almost obsessively punctual, dragging their trash cans to the curb at the exact same moment every Tuesday, perfectly lined up, never out of order. Mr. Grant, 3 houses down, raised his flag every morning and lowered it every night, his face set with solemn focus as though the entire block depended on his discipline. I admired them in a way, these small devotions to routine. It made me feel like I had landed in a place where people cared about order, where everything had its place. I leaned into that, working on my own routines, sanding the porch rail when paint began to peel, mowing the grass into neat stripes, and raking leaves into clean piles. Not because I loved doing it, but because it felt right here. It felt expected. The HOA was mostly invisible at this point, a name on a newsletter, a logo on a letterhead. Their presence was quiet, almost background noise. But it was there. Their first letter to me had been framed as a friendly reminder, and I had convinced myself it was nothing. Still, I noticed how neighbors sometimes glanced at each other's houses, how their eyes flickered across lawns, mailboxes, and shutters, like they were measuring them against something unseen. It was subtle, but it was there, a sense of being watched. One Saturday, while edging the lawn, I saw a car I didn't recognize stop at the end of the street. A woman inside scribbled something on a clipboard before driving slowly past each house. When she reached mine, she lingered just long enough for me to feel a twist of unease in my chest. I waved, but she didn't wave back. She just wrote something down, then moved on. Later that week, another letter arrived in the mailbox. This one wasn't about trash bins or lawns. It was about community harmony. The wording was vague, almost poetic, about how small details created the bigger picture and how individual choices shaped the shared environment. No direct accusation, no clear demand. But I read it 3 times, feeling like there was something buried in the language, something I was supposed to understand without them saying it outright. I asked myself, was it really about harmony? Or was it about control dressed up in friendly words? The more I thought about it, the more I noticed things I had ignored before. The way certain neighbors whispered at the curb, glancing toward houses that didn't quite match the perfect standard. The way the HOA newsletter always carried a tone of cheerfulness that didn't feel natural, like a smile held too long. The way people carried themselves, careful, measured, as though a single mistake could ripple through the street. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, life was still good. My house stood strong, my garden grew, and my days unfolded with the same dependable rhythm. I grilled dinner on the patio in the evenings, I walked through the neighborhood at dusk, and I enjoyed the peace I had worked hard to earn. And yet, there were moments when that peace cracked, even if only slightly. Like when a neighbor's mailbox went missing overnight and was replaced within days by a brand new one, identical to the rest. No one spoke about it, but the speed and silence of the replacement felt deliberate. Or when I saw a small note taped to a front door down the block, gone by the next morning, the family inside looking just a little more strained when they waved hello. These moments didn't last long, but they stacked up in my mind. Little things that added up to a feeling I couldn't quite shake. That sense of being watched, of being measured, of being one small misstep away from crossing a line I didn't fully understand. And through it all, the neighborhood kept smiling. The lawns stayed green, the driveways stayed swept, and the children kept laughing. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But beneath the surface, I felt it. The calm wasn't natural, it was enforced. I didn't know it yet, but those little letters, those clipped phrases about harmony and compliance, were only the beginning. The cracks in Maplewood Grove were there, waiting to spread. And when they did, they wouldn't just scratch at the surface. They would tear the place open. By the time summer rolled into Maplewood Grove, I had settled into the rhythm of the neighborhood so deeply it almost felt like I had been there forever. Morning walks, evening porch lights, the hum of sprinklers cutting across the silence, every detail stitched itself into the fabric of my days. It was safe. It was predictable. It was exactly what I thought I had been searching for. But safety, I was starting to realize, has a price. It began with little moments that most people wouldn't think twice about. One evening, I came home to find a paper tucked into the crack of my front door. It wasn't a letter, exactly, more like a notice, printed in the same friendly font the HOA always used. This time, it was a community appreciation reminder about keeping sidewalks free from clutter. The word clutter was bolded, though I couldn't see what it referred to. My walkway was clear. My porch was tidy. Still, the paper felt like a message aimed squarely at me. The next morning, while sipping my coffee on the porch, I saw Mrs. Avery glance toward my house as she bent over her roses. It wasn't a long look, just a flicker, but it felt like judgment. Across the street, the Millers dragged their trash bins out in their usual synchronized fashion, perfectly aligned as always. And for the first time, I noticed how mechanical it all seemed, like people weren't just following habits but performing them, as though someone was always keeping score. I couldn't shake the thought, was I being tested? One Saturday, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, something I didn't usually do. From the sidewalk, I noticed things I had missed before. Every mailbox was the same height, the same color, and the same design. Every house had shutters painted in one of only 3 approved shades. Every lawn was cropped short, each driveway swept spotless. It was beautiful, yes, but also unsettling. Too perfect. Too controlled. And then I saw it. A small house at the edge of the neighborhood with shutters just slightly darker than the rest. On the porch railing, there was peeling paint. Nothing drastic, nothing outrageous, just small imperfections. But in front of the house, on the ground near the mailbox, was a folded paper weighed down with a rock. A notice. I didn't linger long, but the image stuck in my mind. Someone had broken the rhythm, and the HOA had noticed. When I returned to my own home, my eyes scanned my yard with fresh unease. Was the grass too long? Were the hedges uneven? Did the porch light burn too dim? I found myself studying the details, searching for flaws I hadn't seen before. The perfection of the neighborhood no longer felt like pride. It felt like pressure. The third letter arrived in mid-July. This one was more direct. It cited community concerns about uniformity and asked for immediate attention to unspecified details. It didn't accuse me outright, but it didn't have to. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, suggesting that my home, my sanctuary, was being watched, inspected, and judged. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel at ease sitting on my porch. Instead of comfort, I felt exposed. The street that had once given me peace now felt like a stage, and every neighbor like an audience waiting for me to falter. And yet, life went on. Children still rode their bikes in circles, neighbors still waved as they passed, and lawns still glistened with morning dew. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But for me, the air was heavier. Each newsletter in the mailbox felt like a warning. Each glance from a neighbor carried more weight than it should have. It wasn't fear that crept in, not yet. It was something quieter, something colder. Suspicion. I began to notice how often cars I didn't recognize cruised through the neighborhood, slowing near houses, sometimes stopping altogether. I noticed how quickly violations were corrected, almost as if people had been expecting the notices. I noticed how no one ever spoke about the HOA openly, not in the driveways, not at the block parties, not even in whispers. It was as though the entire community had agreed on a silent pact. We don't question, we don't resist, we comply. And that silence was louder than anything else. At night, when the street was quiet and the only light came from the soft glow of porch bulbs, I would sit awake, wondering how long peace could last when it came with so many conditions. Could a neighborhood truly be safe if everyone lived under constant scrutiny? Could it be called home if it required this much control? I didn't know the answers then. All I knew was that something was shifting. The calm, steady life I had built here was starting to feel less like freedom and more like a cage. And cages, no matter how polished, eventually crack. The letters were only the beginning. The real storm hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel it waiting just beyond the horizon. The first notice could have been ignored. A gentle reminder about lawn care, tucked neatly into my mailbox, its words written in a tone that tried too hard to sound friendly. They claimed my grass exceeded the community height standard by 1 inch. 1 inch. I remember standing in the yard that day, staring down at the blades, wondering how anyone could possibly see the difference without a ruler in hand. It felt absurd, like a bad joke. But the letter ended with a fine. Small enough to pay without protest, but big enough to sting. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. Pay it, move on, and keep the peace. That's what good neighbors did here. Or so I thought. 2 weeks later, another envelope appeared. This one claimed my trash bins had been left visible for an extended period after pickup. The truth? They'd been out for less than 2 hours while I was stuck on a work call. Again, the tone was light, almost cheerful, but the fine at the bottom wasn't. The words, "Failure to comply may result in further action," hummed in the back of my mind long after I crumpled the paper. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. Mistakes happen. Maybe someone just filed a complaint at the wrong time. I shrugged it off. But deep down, I felt the first crack in my sense of safety. The third notice came less than a month later. This time, it wasn't about my lawn or trash. It was my mailbox. According to the HOA, my mailbox did not meet the uniform design standard. Never mind that it was brand new, freshly painted, and sturdier than half the rusted ones down the street. Never mind that I had chosen the style specifically to match my house. The letter demanded immediate replacement, or escalating fines would follow. I remember driving around the neighborhood that evening, staring at other mailboxes. Some were dented. Some were chipped. Some leaned slightly, like they hadn't been set into the ground properly. Yet none of those houses seemed to be facing violations. None of those neighbors looked burdened by threats. It felt targeted, deliberate. And though I didn't want to admit it, the thought gnawed at me. Why me? I replaced the mailbox anyway, swallowing the frustration in hopes that compliance would buy me peace. But peace never came. Instead, the violations piled up. A notice about a non-compliant porch light that wasn't bright enough. A warning about a visible garden hose coiled neatly beside my spigot. A fine for clutter on my porch, which was nothing more than a pair of boots drying in the sun. Each envelope carried the same tone, polite, cheerful, almost neighborly. But beneath the sugarcoating, the message was clear: you are being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I saw it with my own eyes. Cars I didn't recognize slowed in front of my house, drivers scribbling on clipboards or snapping photos before rolling on. Neighbors lingered a little too long when passing, their eyes flicking over my lawn, my shutters, and my driveway. Once, while I was raking leaves, I caught sight of a woman I didn't know parked across the street. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was watching me. The tension settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't put down. My own home, the place I had worked so hard to earn, the place that was supposed to bring peace, no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage, and I was being graded on every move. I tried harder. I trimmed the lawn twice a week. I swept the porch daily. I dragged the trash bins in within minutes of pickup. I checked the porch light bulb obsessively, making sure it shone brightly at night. But no matter how perfectly I complied, another letter arrived. Another fine. Another reminder that nothing I did would ever be enough. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of notices spread before me. Each one was typed, dated, and recorded in official language. Looking at them lined up like evidence, I realized something that made my stomach turn. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. This was about control. The HOA wasn't interested in harmony. They were interested in obedience. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. I crumpled the most recent letter, the one about my porch light, and tossed it aside. My hands were shaking, not with fear this time, but with anger. It didn't matter how much I bent or how much I complied. They weren't going to stop. They wanted to push, to press, to see how far they could go before I broke. That night, I sat awake long after the streetlights flickered on, staring out at the row of perfect houses, the glowing porches, and the neat driveways. It was all so calm, so orderly, so deceptively peaceful. But beneath that surface, I could feel the hostility humming like electricity in the wires above. And I couldn't help but wonder, how far were they willing to go? Violations didn't just keep coming, they started to cut deeper. At first, the fines were irritating but manageable, like an annoying mosquito bite. But by now, the amounts were climbing. $50 for a lawn violation. $75 for the trash bins. $100 for the porch light. Every envelope seemed to carry a bigger number, as though the HOA were testing how much they could squeeze out of me before I cracked. I noticed a pattern. The notices didn't arrive randomly. They came after weekends when I had people over or after I spent time outside enjoying my own yard. It was as if someone was watching for the smallest chance to strike, and the HOA was more than willing to back them up. The most humiliating blow came on a Monday morning. I walked out to grab the newspaper and nearly tripped over a bright orange sticker plastered across my front door, Notice of Noncompliance. The bold red letters announced to the entire street that my property had been flagged. It wasn't just a letter slipped quietly into my mailbox anymore. This was public shaming. I stood frozen on the porch, the paper crinkling under my fingers as I tore it down. My neighbors were already outside, heading to their cars, walking their dogs. I caught their glances, quick, sharp, and curious. They didn't say anything, but they didn't have to. The message was clear. I had been marked. Inside, my hands shook with anger as I spread the sticker across the table. The violation? Improper landscaping. They claimed a section of my flower bed didn't match the approved plant list. A flower bed. These were tulips, bright and cheerful, planted to honor my late mother. Now, according to the HOA, they were inconsistent with neighborhood standards. That violation felt personal. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about erasing my choices, stripping away anything that made my home mine. I ripped the sticker in half. But the shame lingered. It wasn't just me who saw it. It was my neighbors, people I waved to every morning, people who probably whispered later about what rule I had broken this time. I didn't just feel singled out. I felt humiliated. From that point on, I couldn't shake the sense that the HOA wanted me gone. Every letter dripped with the same cheerful but menacing undertone, like they were trying to push me toward one inevitable conclusion: either submit completely or give up and leave. But leaving wasn't an option. This was my home, my investment, my life. I wasn't going to be bullied into abandoning it. So I started documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every photo they sent. I built a binder thick with evidence, hoping that one day I could fight back. I even began taking pictures of my own yard daily, proving that the grass was cut, the bins were in, and the porch light was on. I knew I couldn't stop the harassment, but maybe I could defend myself from the fallout. Still, no binder could protect me from what came next. One Friday evening, I arrived home to find a stranger standing in my driveway. He wore a bright yellow vest and carried a clipboard, the kind used by inspectors. My stomach dropped as he introduced himself as a representative hired by the HOA to perform a compliance check. Without asking, he began walking around my property, snapping photos of my fence, my shrubs, and even the side of my garage. I asked if he had a warrant or any right to be there. He simply shrugged, pointing to the bylaws of the HOA that supposedly gave him inspection privileges. He didn't stop until he had walked the entire perimeter of my home. That night, I didn't sleep. The idea of someone trespassing on my property, photographing every corner of my private space under the HOA's blessing, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was surveillance. The following week, 3 new violations appeared in my mailbox. One claimed my fence was faded. Another said my driveway had visible cracks. The third, almost laughably, accused me of excessive clutter in the garage, as though they had somehow peered inside. That was when the fear set in. I started to wonder how much they could see. Did someone on the board live close by, watching through their window, reporting every little detail? Were my neighbors complicit, filing anonymous complaints to curry favor with the association? Every face I passed on the street suddenly seemed suspicious. Every wave carried a question mark. By now, my evenings were no longer spent relaxing on the porch or enjoying my yard. They were spent fixing, cleaning, and documenting, desperately trying to get ahead of the next inevitable violation. I worked like a prisoner keeping a cell spotless for inspections, but it was never enough. Another letter always came. The harassment was more than financial. It was psychological. Every day, they chipped away at my peace, my privacy, and my dignity. And every time I thought it couldn't get worse, they proved me wrong. One night, I stepped out to take the trash bins in, only to notice tire tracks across my lawn. Someone had driven up onto my property. When I checked the mailbox, I found yet another notice waiting for me, this one accusing me of damaged landscaping. That was the moment it hit me like a brick. The HOA wasn't just waiting for me to fail. They were setting me up to fail. And I couldn't shake the growing question. If they were willing to go this far, how far would they push me next? By this point, it was no longer about compliance. I could trim the grass with military precision, repaint the fence every weekend, and replace the porch light with something that could guide ships in the night. None of it mattered. The violations kept landing in my mailbox like clockwork, each one heavier than the last. The fines weren't just growing in number. They were growing in size. What started as $50 penalties had turned into $200, then $300. Some came stamped with bold red letters. Final notice, failure to pay may result in legal action. The numbers added up quickly, eating into savings I had worked years to build. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the feeling of being cornered, like a prey animal constantly hunted. I never knew when the next blow would come, only that it would. The board meetings were supposed to offer answers. Every month, residents gathered in the clubhouse to discuss community business. I decided to go, hoping I could face the people behind the endless letters and at least get clarity. Walking into that meeting felt like stepping into enemy territory. The room was filled with rows of folding chairs, the faint smell of stale coffee hanging in the air. At the front sat the board, a small group of neighbors who wore the same smug expressions, their binders stacked neatly in front of them like weapons. When it was my turn to speak, I explained calmly that I had complied with every notice, that I had photographic proof of my lawn, my bins, and my porch light. I asked why, despite everything, the violations never stopped. Their response was chilling in its emptiness. They shuffled papers, exchanged glances, and then repeated the same scripted lines about standards and uniformity and community aesthetics. When I pressed for specifics, one of them leaned forward and said, in the same polite tone the letters used, "If you're struggling to keep up, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." The words hit like a slap. Struggling to keep up? I wasn't failing. I was being set up to fail. And now they were saying it out loud. Maybe I didn't belong here. I left the meeting with my heart pounding and my fists clenched. That night, I couldn't shake the looks I got in that room. Some neighbors nodded along with the board, others avoided eye contact entirely. The message was clear, the board had power, and anyone who questioned it risked being ostracized. The isolation grew. Friends who used to wave when they passed my house now looked the other way. Conversations on the sidewalk went quiet when I approached. It was as if my neighbors had been warned, side with me and risk becoming the next target. Then came the lien notice. One afternoon, I opened the mailbox to find a thick envelope stamped with official lettering. Inside was a letter from the HOA's attorney, cold and direct. They were placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines. If I didn't pay, they could pursue foreclosure. Foreclosure. Over tulips, trash bins, and porch lights. My stomach twisted as I read the words again and again. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was a direct threat to my home. My safe place was on the line, and they were willing to take it from me. I called the attorney listed on the letter, my voice shaking with anger. He spoke with rehearsed indifference, reminding me that I had agreed to the bylaws when I bought into the neighborhood. Every fine, every violation, every penalty was legally enforceable. His tone made it sound as though my fate was already sealed. That night, I spread all the letters, fines, and notices across the floor. The binder I had kept was bursting, but even with all the evidence, I felt powerless. They weren't following logic. They weren't following fairness. They were following control, and they had the law on their side. The pressure bled into every corner of my life. I stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed they'd see the orange stickers or overhear the gossip. I avoided my yard, afraid of being photographed or reported. Even inside, I felt suffocated, knowing the HOA could strike at any moment. And then, as though they hadn't already done enough, they came for my car. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright yellow boot clamped to my front tire. A notice on the windshield announced it was immobilized due to unpaid HOA fees. My car, my lifeline to work, groceries, everything, had been taken hostage right in my own driveway. Neighbors walked past, pretending not to look, but I saw their eyes. Some were sympathetic, others curious, and a few almost satisfied. The humiliation was complete. As I stood there, fists clenched and heart pounding, a single thought echoed in my mind. If they could do this to me, they could do anything. And if I didn't push back, they would. The car boot should have broken me. For most people, that kind of humiliation would have been the end of the fight, a quiet surrender to the HOA's relentless power. But instead, it did something unexpected. It sharpened my resolve. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was ready. Still, the HOA wasn't finished. They pushed harder, testing how far they could twist the knife. The next notice wasn't about grass, mailboxes, or light bulbs. It was about noise. According to the letter, my property had been the source of excessive disturbances late at night. The claim was absurd. I lived alone, I didn't host parties, and most evenings ended with me quietly reading or watching television. But the HOA insisted, attaching complaints from anonymous neighbors. They threatened new fines if I didn't maintain acceptable noise levels. It was a trick. They couldn't prove it, but that wasn't the point. The goal was to stack violations, to make me look like a chronic rule breaker no matter what. I started noticing things I hadn't before. A car idling down the block late at night. A neighbor walking their dog, stopping just a little too close to my yard, listening. Once, I swore I heard someone tapping on my fence in the dark. They weren't just accusing me of noise. They were creating it. Soon after came another blow. One morning, I stepped outside to find a fresh violation notice taped directly to my garage door. This one accused me of improper storage of recreational equipment. I stared in disbelief. The only equipment was a bicycle leaning against the wall inside my garage. Somehow, they had seen it, or claimed they had, and turned it into yet another offense. It dawned on me that there were no limits anymore. If a bicycle in my private garage could become an HOA violation, nothing was off the table. My privacy was gone, my freedom stripped, my life micromanaged by people who thrived on control. The financial pressure mounted alongside the psychological toll. The running total of fines was staggering now, climbing into the thousands. The lien on my home loomed larger with each notice. The HOA wasn't simply harassing me anymore. They were tightening a noose around my property, threatening to choke the very roof over my head. I began to wonder if this was their plan from the beginning. Push me with violations, bury me with fines, then swoop in to seize my home when I couldn't keep up. It wasn't just about order or appearances. It was about power, money, and control. The worst moment came when I returned from work one evening to find a letter slipped under my door, not in the mailbox this time. My stomach sank as I unfolded it. The message was short, chilling, and direct. Failure to comply will result in legal removal from the community. Legal removal. Eviction. They weren't just threatening my car, my yard, or my finances anymore. They were threatening me. That night, I couldn't sit still. I paced the house, heart racing, my binder of evidence spread open across the table. I reread every violation, every photograph, and every receipt. It all painted the same picture. No matter how much I tried, I would never win by playing their game. I thought about the neighbors who looked away when I passed, about the board members with their smug smiles, and about the endless stream of letters designed to break me. They thought they had cornered me, that I would either crumble under the pressure or quietly disappear. But they were wrong. Something inside me snapped that night. The quiet compliance, the desperate attempts to prove myself, the endless cycle of fixing and paying and hoping for mercy, it was over. I realized that if they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And not the kind they expected. The night I decided enough was enough, the air felt different. Heavy. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by papers that had come to define my life, violation notices, fines, legal threats, every ugly reminder of the HOA's chokehold. For weeks, I had been pacing like a caged animal, waiting for their next move. But now, something in me had shifted. Fear no longer ruled me. It was anger now. And determination. I had built a binder thick with evidence, photos time-stamped, receipts collected, and letters saved in chronological order. For months, I had been quietly gathering everything they threw at me, thinking it would one day be useful. Now that day had come. The HO thought they held all the cards. They had the board. They had the bylaws. They had the power to fine, to shame, and to threaten foreclosure. But what they didn't know was that their power had limits, and I was ready to push them to the edge. The final straw had been the letter slipped under my door. Failure to comply will result in legal removal. That wasn't just intimidation. That was a line in the sand. And once they crossed it, they gave me something priceless, proof of harassment that no reasonable judge could ignore. I wasn't going to sit quietly anymore. I was going to fight back. The first step was simple. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, one who specialized in property disputes and HOA abuse cases. When I walked into his office with my binder under my arm, I felt like a soldier carrying ammunition. He listened carefully as I laid everything out. The arbitrary fines, the selective enforcement, the trespassing inspector, the lien notice, and the threats of eviction. Every word I spoke seemed to sharpen his expression. By the time I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "They've gone too far. Much too far." That sentence lit something inside me. For the first time in months, I felt validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. This was real and someone else could see it too. The lawyer explained the plan. We'd file a formal complaint. We'd demand the fines be removed, the lien lifted, and the harassment stopped. And if the HOA resisted, we'd take it to court. It sounded simple on paper, but I knew what it really meant: war. The next HOA board meeting arrived like a storm cloud. I walked into the clubhouse with my binder clutched tight, my lawyer beside me. The room buzzed with low chatter, neighbors turning in their seats to watch us. For months, I had walked into these meetings alone, feeling small under the weight of their stares. But tonight I had backup. The boards sat at the front, smug as ever, their binders stacked neatly, their expressions unreadable. When my name was called, I rose, walked to the microphone, and for the first time, I didn't tremble. I laid it all out. Every violation. Everything's fine. Every instance of harassment and intimidation. I held up photos, receipts, timestamps, and letters. I showed the bright orange stickers, the absurd claims, and the illegal threats. My lawyer punctuated my words with legal terms that sliced through their carefully rehearsed language. The room was silent except for my voice. Neighbors shifted in their chairs, some looking shocked, others guilty, and a few even nodding as if they had known all along but were too afraid to say it. When I finished, the board tried to recover. They shuffled papers, exchanged glances, and attempted to dismiss my evidence as misunderstandings or necessary enforcement. But my lawyer cut them off, pointing out the inconsistencies, the selective targeting, and the outright harassment. Finally, he said the words that shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. "We are prepared to take this to court." The board froze. For the first time, their smug smiles faltered. The meeting ended in chaos. Neighbors whispered, board members stormed out, and I stood taller than I had in months. For once, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. But I knew better than to think it was over. People like that didn't back down easily. The HOA wasn't just going to roll over. No, this was only the beginning. The confrontation had been public, loud, and humiliating for them. And people drunk on power don't forgive humiliation. Walking out of that clubhouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that I had finally stood up, dread for what was to come, and a fire of determination that burned hotter than ever. The war had begun. And deep down, I knew this battle would push both sides to their breaking point. Board meeting was supposed to scare them into backing down. At least, that's what I told myself walking out of that clubhouse with my lawyer at my side, neighbors buzzing in the background about everything they had just seen. For the first time, I felt the weight shift ever so slightly. The HOA was no longer untouchable. But if I thought that public confrontation was the peak of the storm, I was wrong. The real storm came after. The very next morning, I found another letter taped to my front door. The paper was thicker this time, official-looking, and stamped with the board seal. My heart pounded as I ripped it free. The words inside were simple but chilling. Effective immediately, your access to all community amenities has been suspended due to non-compliance and ongoing disputes with the HOA. Amenities. That meant the pool, the gym, the clubhouse, and even the park benches were technically under their control. None of it mattered much to me personally, but the symbolism was clear. They were cutting me off, isolating me further, and making an example out of me. I could feel the neighbors' eyes on me as I stood in my driveway with the letter crumpled in my fist. Some sympathetic, some curious, some no doubt pleased. The board was striking back, and they wanted the whole community to see it. By noon, the retaliation had escalated. My phone buzzed with an email from the HOA's attorney. Attached was a notice of an emergency board session scheduled specifically to review my case. They had called a meeting just for me, and the language dripped with hostility. They accused me of slander, of disrupting community harmony, of creating a hostile environment. The irony was suffocating. That night I barely slept. My mind spun with images of that upcoming session. I knew what they wanted: to silence me, to paint me as the villain in front of the very neighbors I was trying to reach. The meeting arrived faster than I was ready for. The clubhouse felt different this time. Darker, heavier, charged with tension. Neighbors packed the chairs, some standing in the back. Whispers rippled through the room as I walked in. The boards sat at the front like judges in a trial, their binders lined up neatly, their faces hard and cold. When my name was called, I stood. My lawyer wasn't with me this time. He had advised me to let them dig their own grave. He was right. If they wanted to stage a show, I would let them, and every word would become fuel for the case we were building. The board began reading a list of accusations. They claimed I was disruptive, non-compliant, and disrespectful of the rules. They said my behavior was damaging the reputation of the community. They even hinted that if I continued, they would pursue legal action against me personally for defamation. The words rolled over me like waves, but I didn't flinch. I stood in silence, letting them pile the charges higher and higher, each one more absurd than the last. And all the while I could feel the neighbors watching. Some frowned, some whispered, and some looked down at their hands. Finally, when they finished, I raised my hand. Calmly, deliberately. And when they reluctantly nodded, I spoke. I told the room that I had documented every violation, every fine, every letter, every visit, and every threat. I told them I had evidence, not just accusations, not just words, but hard proof. And then I let the silence hang. The shift in the room was almost physical. Whispers broke out again, louder this time. Neighbors turned to each other, eyebrows raised. For the first time, the board looked uneasy. Then I added one final line, my voice steady and clear. If this continues, I won't be the one answering questions in court. Gasps rippled through the room. One board member's face flushed red. Another clenched his jaw. The head of the board leaned forward and slammed his binder shut with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. The meeting dissolved into chaos. People shouting, board members trying to restore order, neighbors demanding answers. I slipped out quietly, heart racing, hands trembling. That night, I sat by the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawns and spotless sidewalks, the false calm of the neighborhood I once loved. But beneath that calm, something was shifting. The HOA had tried to put me on trial in front of everyone, but in their arrogance, they had exposed themselves. They had shown the community exactly what they were willing to do to silence opposition. I knew then that the climax wasn't coming in a quiet letter or another fine. It would come in the open in a way no one could ignore. And when it did, the HOA wouldn't just lose their grip on me. They would lose the illusion of power they had over everyone. Days after that emergency session stretched like wires pulled too tight. Every moment felt tense, like something was about to snap. I woke each morning bracing myself for the next strike from the HOA. I checked my mailbox with dread, walked outside knowing I was watched, and lived in constant expectation of another letter, another fine, another humiliation. But what came next was bigger than anything they had thrown at me before. One crisp morning, I returned home to find a bright orange sign staked in my front yard. In bold black letters, it read, "Property in violation, action pending." It wasn't just a letter this time. It was a billboard of shame planted in my lawn for the entire community to see. Neighbors slowed as they walked by. Some stared. Some shook their heads. Some avoided eye contact. The HOA had escalated their war into a public spectacle. I ripped the sign from the ground, my hands shaking with rage. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was character assassination. They wanted to turn me into an outcast, to poison my name in the neighborhood until I had no allies left. But what they didn't realize was that by making their abuse public, they had played right into my hands. I called my lawyer immediately. Within hours, he had drafted a cease and desist letter citing harassment, defamation, and abuse of authority. But that was only the beginning. He filed an injunction demanding the removal of the lien and the elimination of all fines, attaching the mountain of evidence we had collected. And because of the public humiliation tactics, he filed for damages too. The HOA had overplayed their hand. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about lawsuits, about legal trouble, and about the possibility that the board itself could be dissolved. Some even knocked on my door quietly at night, sharing their own stories of harassment, of fines for trivial things, of threats they had endured but never spoken about. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. My fight had become more than personal. It was a spark that others were ready to follow. The climax arrived on a Tuesday evening, inside the very clubhouse where this war had begun. The courtroom-like setup was the same, but this time the stakes were real. My lawyer sat beside me, files neatly stacked, his expression calm but sharp. The board members sat stiffly, their attorney whispering frantically in their ears. The tension was suffocating. When the judge called the session to order, the board tried to spin their story. They painted me as a disruptive neighbor who refused to follow rules. They claimed the fines were justified, the lien legal, and the signs necessary community enforcement. Their words rang hollow, rehearsed, and desperate. Then it was our turn. My lawyer spoke with precision, his voice steady but edged with fire. He laid out the evidence one piece at a time. He held up letters, projected photos, and read dates and times. He showed the orange violation stickers, the threatening notes, and the trespassing inspector. He presented the orange sign, the ultimate symbol of their harassment. And then he unveiled what I had been waiting for. A compilation of statements from neighbors. Real people who had lived under the same shadow, who had stories of intimidation, threats, and unfair fines. One by one, their accounts painted a picture of an HOA that was less about community standards and more about unchecked power. The board shifted uneasily in their seats. Their attorney's face tightened. For the first time, They looked less like rulers and more like defendants. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room grew thick. Every person there, neighbors, board members, and me, held their breath, waiting for the hammer to fall. And then came the words that would change everything. The actions taken by this HOA demonstrate harassment and abuse of authority. The liens are to be lifted immediately, the fines rescinded, and damages are to be awarded to the homeowner. The board froze. The room erupted. Some neighbors gasped, others clapped softly, and a few even whispered, "Finally." I sat there, stunned, relief flooding through me like a wave. Months of fear, humiliation, and rage all collapsed into a single moment of vindication. I had won. Not just for myself, but for every neighbor who had lived under their boot. But the victory wasn't just in the ruling. It was in what came after. As we walked out of the courtroom-like clubhouse, reporters who had caught wind of the case snapped photos. Neighbors crowded around, some thanking me, some telling me I had given them courage. The board members slipped out quietly, their faces pale, their power crumbling. The fight had reached its peak, and the mighty HOA had been humbled in front of everyone. Yet even in that moment of triumph, one thought echoed in my mind. Power never disappears quietly. The war might be won, but the story wasn't over. Because what happens when those who thrive on control finally lose it? The ruling had been delivered, the gavel struck, and the HOA's carefully built tower of intimidation had finally cracked. But victory in a room doesn't always feel real until you see how the world outside reacts. The next morning, I opened my blinds and stared at my street. For months, I had dreaded stepping outside, certain that each neighbor's glance was laced with judgment or quiet satisfaction at my misery. But this morning felt different. The orange violation stickers were gone. The liens were legally void. The threat letters were nothing more than evidence now, locked in a file labeled "Case Closed." For the first time in months, my driveway was just a driveway, not a stage for humiliation. I walked outside cautiously, unsure how I would be received. And that's when it began. A neighbor across the street gave a small nod, almost shy. Another waved awkwardly. Later that afternoon, a couple I barely knew knocked on my door, holding a plate of cookies like something out of a forgotten era of civility. They thanked me quietly for standing up, confessed their own horror stories about the board, and admitted they'd been too scared to speak. That was the moment I realized the true impact of what had happened. My battle hadn't just lifted the weight from my shoulders, it had given others permission to breathe. But the board didn't vanish overnight. Their power had been clipped, yes, but people drunk on control rarely admit defeat easily. At the next official HOA meeting, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Neighbors filled the clubhouse to capacity, their voices sharper, their eyes unafraid. When the board members shuffled in, the air shifted. They looked smaller, stripped of the smug confidence that had once radiated off them like heat. The president cleared his throat, trying to begin the meeting as usual, but the crowd wasn't having it. One by one, neighbors began speaking out. Questions were fired like arrows. Why were funds spent on endless legal battles? Why were residents threatened with foreclosure? Who approved the violation signs? The board stammered. They tried to redirect, to maintain control, but the walls were closing in. And then someone said the word that broke the dam: recall. The murmurs exploded into a roar. Petitions began circulating that very night. Within weeks, signatures poured in. The president resigned quietly, followed by 2 other board members. Those who remained clung to their seats for a time, but the tide had turned. The HOA, once untouchable, was now under the microscope of its own community. And through it all, I sat quietly in the back of the room. I wasn't leading the charge anymore. I didn't need to. The neighbors had found their voices, and once a voice is freed, it doesn't go back to silence. At home, the changes were just as tangible. No more orange stickers. No more threatening letters. No more shadow of fines waiting for me at the mailbox. My lawyer finalized the settlement for damages, and with the money, I repaired the wear and tear the HOA had ignored for months. My house no longer looked like a battleground. It looked like home again. Yet the most powerful change wasn't physical. It was emotional. For months, I had felt caged, suffocated, and stripped of dignity. Every walk outside had been a march under scrutiny. Every sound of paper sliding into my mailbox had been a trigger for dread. That weight was gone now. One evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and listened to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. For once, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. Birds chirped in the distance. A child's laughter echoed faintly from the cul-de-sac. Life had texture again. But while peace settled over my home, I couldn't shake the bigger realization. This wasn't just about one homeowner fighting back. It was about an entire system that thrives in silence. For every neighborhood where someone stands up, there are dozens where people don't, where fear keeps them compliant, and where HOAs rule unchecked. That thought lingered as I prepared for bed that night. Yes, I had won my battle. But the war between power and fairness, between intimidation and courage, still burned far beyond my street. And that's when I knew my story wasn't just ending. It was becoming something larger. The HOA had underestimated me. They thought I would be an easy target, a cautionary tale to keep others quiet. But instead, I became something else entirely, proof that they could be beaten. Proof that no board, no matter how smug, no matter how ruthless, was above accountability. The ripple effect was undeniable. Neighbors began talking more openly, not just in whispers over fences, but in groups, in meetings, and in letters addressed to the board. The clubhouse, once a chamber of intimidation, became a place where real questions were asked and real answers demanded. And though I didn't crave the spotlight, I knew my stand had sparked something. The story wasn't just about an HOA gone too far. It was about what happens when ordinary people finally decide enough is enough. Months passed, and the scars of the battle slowly healed, but their lessons never left. The HOA, once a looming presence that dictated everything from the shade of blinds to the length of grass, had been stripped of its invulnerability. What had been a board feared by all was now a body held accountable by the very residents it once ruled over. The recall petition succeeded. The old board members, those who had sat smug and unchallenged for years, were gone. In their place came a mix of new faces, neighbors who had lived in silence for too long, now emboldened to step up. They weren't perfect, and they didn't hold all the answers, but their presence alone marked a shift, leadership by the community, not over the community. Meetings transformed. Where once they had been rigid spectacles of intimidation, they became open forums. Neighbors actually spoke without fear of glares or gavel-banging interruptions. Budgets were explained, decisions debated, and votes taken transparently. For the first time, people felt like members of a neighborhood instead of subjects of a regime. And while my own fight had ended in the courtroom that day, its echoes reached far further than I expected. I began to receive calls and emails from people outside our community, friends of friends, strangers who had heard about the case. They told me about their own battles, their own HOA nightmares. They asked how I had done it, where I had found the courage, and how they could start. I didn't see myself as a leader, but I understood then that stories have power. My binder of evidence, once a symbol of isolation, became a roadmap for others. Step by step, I explained what I had done. Document everything, find allies, don't let intimidation silence you, and never underestimate the strength of persistence. Some evenings, I would walk through the neighborhood and see children playing in yards without fear their toys would be labeled violations, gardens blooming without constant threat of fines, and neighbors lingering to chat instead of rushing indoors under a cloud of suspicion. The difference wasn't just in the rules, it was in the atmosphere. Freedom had returned in small, almost invisible ways, but it was there, and it was undeniable. Still, victory carried its own weight. People often asked me if it had been worth it, the sleepless nights, the stress, the endless confrontation. And the truth is, it came at a cost. I had lost time, peace, and months of my life to that fight. But I had gained something far more valuable, proof that no system, no matter how entrenched, is unbreakable. One evening, the community held a gathering at the clubhouse. Not a meeting, but a real gathering, food, music, and laughter. The same building where I had once stood trembling under accusation now echoed with warmth and connection. A neighbor I barely knew raised a glass in my direction and said, To the one who stood up when the rest of us were afraid. The room erupted in applause. My face flushed, but my heart swelled. I hadn't fought for applause, but in that moment, I felt something close to peace. And yet, beneath the celebration, a quieter thought lingered. How many other neighborhoods were still suffering in silence? How many families lived under the weight of boards that thrived on fear? That question became my takeaway, the thought I couldn't shake. Because the truth is, this story wasn't about me. It wasn't even just about my neighborhood. It was about a bigger truth. Power unchecked will always push until someone pushes back. And it takes only one person to start that push. In the months and years that followed, I lived more freely, more gratefully. My home was no longer a battleground but a sanctuary again. The sound of paper sliding into my mailbox no longer sent a chill down my spine. Instead, it was just mail, ordinary and harmless. That ordinary peace, after everything, felt extraordinary. Looking back, I realized the HOA had given me something they never intended, a voice. They tried to break me, but instead, they forged me into someone stronger. Someone willing to stand not just for myself, but for others who couldn't. And maybe that's the real story here. Not about fines or liens, not about violations or bylaws, but about what happens when ordinary people are pushed too far. What happens when fear turns into resolve, when silence breaks into defiance, when one spark becomes a fire that no board can contain. As I sat on my porch one evening, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink, I thought of every sleepless night, every crushing moment of doubt, and every time I had almost given in. And I whispered to myself, not in anger but in triumph, it was worth it. Because in the end, the HOA lost more than a case. They lost their grip, their fear, and their silence. And I, the neighbor they tried to erase, became the proof that their power was never absolute. And that's the takeaway I leave with you. If you were in my place, if your peace was stolen, if your dignity was dragged through the mud, would you fight back? Or would you let silence become your cage? The answer, I've learned, changes everything.